Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. I'm Maria Salvador, your moderator for today's program. I'm joined in the studio audience by students from Prince William County. There are many awards for young people's literature, and there are few that this author has not received. With us is Katherine Paterson, recipient of not one but 2 Newbery Medals, 2 National Book Awards, and the Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction, just to name a few. For the body of her work, Ms. Paterson has received the Regina Medal, the Hans Christian Andersen Award, and the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award. She is truly a legend in her own time, and that's not fiction. Katherine Paterson has been called a living legend by the Library of Congress and was named earlier this year by the Library of Congress and the Children's Book Council as our National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. In her novels, retellings of traditional tales, short books for newly independent readers, and more, Katherine Paterson's books touch deep emotional chords with readers of all ages. Welcome, Katherine Paterson.
Thank you.
You were born in China during very turbulent times. Tell us about your early years.
Well, I remember my first almost 5 years as an idyllic time. Now, I'm sure it wasn't because China was always in turmoil, but we lived in a Chinese house behind a wall. Everybody else behind the wall was Chinese. So I began speaking English and Chinese both very early. In fact, there's a letter that my father wrote to his mother, which sort of says, "What is the matter with this child? I can't shut her up in either language." That's not an exact quote, but that's exactly what he meant. The other children didn't talk this much. The Chinese don't know any child who talks this much. So apparently I was a big talker very early on.
How did you come to be in China?
My parents were missionaries with the Presbyterian Church, and it was my native land and my home.
It's interesting. You moved around a fair amount, too.
Well, war came. The summer, just before I was 5, we were on vacation in the mountains, and Japan began to bomb and to invade. We couldn't go home. My father went down the mountain back across enemy lines to our home, so we didn't know if he was alive or dead for a long time. It was a very frightening time. We looked out our windows and heard the bombers go over. They never actually hit our house, which was nice, but we were very aware that we were in war.
You were an early reader as well as an early talker, and you were self-taught, perhaps by listening to your mother teach your older siblings to read?
Probably so, because my brother and sister were being taught by my mother, and I was jealous. I wanted to read.
What were you reading before you were old enough to be in kindergarten?
Oh, Winnie the Pooh, all of the A.A. Milne books. We had a lot of English books. We had Robert Louis Stevenson that I loved. I was mostly reading the poems at that age and then graduated to the novels. Beatrix Potter, we had all of Beatrix. I had good books when I was a child. So.
It's interesting. And
the Bible. I mean, we, of course, we had Ergemeyer's Bible storybook and the King James Version.
So literature was important to you as a young reader, but it continued to be important to you as a writer when you started writing.
Oh, yes. I'm more of a reader than I am a writer. Yeah, I said to my husband one day, I want this job where all you have to do is read and you don't have to report on anything you've read unless you want to. And he said, I thought you already had that job. I said, no. I have to write to send the kids to college.
Well, Narnia, for example, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien appear in your books. How conscious of you that you're using these great fantasists in your work?
Well, the first time it happened, because of course in the early Japanese books, I was quoting Japanese poetry and novels. But when I wrote Bridge to Terabithia, it was the first novel I'd written that was set in this country. And so Leslie Burke, who is a great reader, is reading Lloyd Alexander and all the Narnia books, and to find, and she wants Jess to read them so he'll know how to behave in a magic kingdom. And I remember my editor saying, some of your readers may not have read these books. And I said, good, then they'll go out and find them and read them. Because I can't imagine a life without books, and I couldn't imagine a reader a person like Leslie Burke without loving books and wanting to share them.
We live in an era where young people have access to screens and immediate, feedback from the internet. How does that? Do you think they'll find books, or are books still relevant to young readers today?
Well, I give J.K. Rowling a great deal of credit because she taught many, many people what books can do that nothing else can do. Because books demand your cooperation. They demand not only your ability to read, but your whole life. You have to bring your whole life to the book, your life experience to the book, your imagination to the book. You have to make, as my son, the movie maker, says, you have to make the movie inside your head. And that's your privilege as a reader. And I don't, as writer, get to tell you how to make that movie. You may be watching a different movie than the one I had in my head when I was writing this book. And that's your privilege as a reader. And you should be very jealous of that privilege and not let a teacher tell you that you can't read this book this way, because that's your privilege.
Interesting.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
For teachers who are listening to this. I have to apologize to teachers a lot, but there you go.
Well, you have some really good ones in your books.
Well, I have some good ones, and then I have some like the ones I had when I was coming along.
Well, you talk about film and the film of the mind, but you were interested in acting early on, weren't you?
Oh, yes. I'm a big ham still. People say, when I talk about being shy, people say, "You're not shy." And I said, "Yes, I'm a shy show-off. I love to perform. I love to read aloud. But I think that goes, a lot of writers are that way. We're very private people who run around naked in public."
Well,
Well, we do. I mean, you know more about me than you have any right to know if you've read my books.
well, that's true. So where do writing and acting intersect, or do they?
Well, when I was a little girl and didn't have, we came to this country and I was considered very weird. I used to play by myself a lot because my older brother and sister were close. My two younger sisters were close, but I was the middle one. So I played by myself a lot, and I used to make up stories in my head and act out all the parts. I'm still making up stories in my head and acting out all the parts. I don't see any difference.
Okay.
It's just that I get paid for it now.
That's interesting. Well, you've won 2 Newbery medals for 2 very different books. Bridge to Terabithia was the first. In your Newbery acceptance speech, you said that you accept the honor for the story that I made up myself, you made up yourself. And then you go on to qualify that statement and talk about the background of Terabithia and the genesis of the book. Would you fill in the backstory of Terabithia for those who don't know it?
Yeah, I'll try not to make it as long as it's possible to make it, because I can make it a really long story. But the upshot was that we were living in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and my son, they closed down the little school that our children were going to, and our son David was sent off to a big new school where he didn't know anybody in his class, and he had been kind of the class clown and the class artist in first grade. Well, now he was in the second grade, and everybody just thought he was weird. So he would come home every day and say, "You can't make me go back to that school. I'm never going back, never, 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 never." And then suddenly one day he came back and he said, me and Lisa Hill made a diorama of a little house in the big woods. And he never talked about anybody but this girl named Lisa Hill. And I'd like to promise you girls that I was thrilled that my son's best friend was a girl, but all I could think of was they thought he was weird before. Now he's never going to fit in. But then I met Lisa, and I realized anybody would be lucky to have her for a best friend. But that summer, she went off to Bethany Beach for vacation. She was up on a hill above the beach, dancing on a rock, because that was the kind of kid she was. And somebody said, who told me years later, they looked up there and saw this happy child dancing up on a rock, and a bolt of lightning came down from the sky and killed her on the spot. And you try to explain that to your 8-year-old, which I couldn't explain it to myself. And so I began to write the book to try to make sense out of something that made no sense to me. Because I knew a story had to make sense. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and when you get to the end, it may not make intellectual sense, but it makes emotional sense to you. So that's why I began to write the book. Not really because I thought it would comfort my son, but because somehow I needed to make sense out of this terrible tragedy for myself.
And literature can do that.
Literature can help.
Lisa is mentioned in the dedication to Bridge to Terabithia, and so is David. But you also use the word bonsai. Why? How?
Well, I lived in Japan for 4 years, and originally the word bonsai, it means literally 10,000 years. And it was a salute to the emperor originally. And you yell bonsai to the emperor, and if you were doing a suicide bombing, then you yell bonsai before you died because you're saluting the emperor, you're doing this for the emperor. But after the emperor was no longer divine, it became more like hooray. So that at sporting events now, the kids will yell hooray, bonsai for their side against the other side. So I was thinking about David and Lisa, and I'd originally dedicated the book to David, but when he read it, or I read it to him first to see if he wanted me to publish it or not, he said, no, it was okay if I sent it to my editor, but he wanted it dedicated to both him and Lisa. So the word bonsai came to my mind because I thought, here's a friendship that I don't want ever to die, and I want to cheer. So that was the only word I could think of that combined both live forever and hooray.
Interesting. There's magic in Terabithia, the kind of magic that sparks imagination and friendship and changes people. Do you mind reading the scene where Terabithia is created?
Okay, I'll be glad to. Do you know what we need? Leslie called to him. Intoxicated as he was with the heavens, he couldn't imagine needing anything on earth. We need a place, she said, just for us. It would be so secret that we would never tell anyone in the whole world about it. Jess came swinging back and dragged his feet to a stop. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper. It might be a whole secret country, she continued, and you and I would be the rulers of it. Her words stirred something inside of him. He'd like to be a ruler of something, even something that wasn't real. Okay, he said. Where can we have it? Over there in the woods where nobody would come and mess it up. There were parts of the woods that Jess did not like. Dark places where it was almost like being underwater, but he didn't say so. I know, she was getting excited. It could be a magic country like Narnia, and the only way you can get in is by swinging across on this enchanted rope. Her eyes were bright. She grabbed the rope. Come on, she said. Let's find a place to build our castle stronghold. They'd only gone a few yards into the woods beyond the creek bed when Leslie stopped. How about right here? She asked. Sure. Jess agreed quickly, relieved that there was no need to plunge deeper into the woods. He would take her there, of course, for he wasn't such a coward that he would mind a little exploring now and then, farther in among the ever-darkening columns of the tall pines. But as a regular thing, as a permanent place, this is where he would choose to be. Here where the dogwood and redwood played hide-and-seek between the oaks and the evergreens, and the sun flung itself in golden streams through the trees to splash warmly at their feet. Sure, he repeated himself, nodding vigorously. The underbrush was dry and it would be easy to clear away. The ground was almost level. This'll be a good place to build. Leslie named their secret land Terabithia, and she loaned Jess all of her books about Narnia, so he would know how things went in a magic kingdom, how the animals and the trees must be protected, and how a ruler must behave. That was the hard part. When Leslie spoke, the words rolling out so regally, you knew she was a proper queen. He could hardly manage English, much less the poetic language of a king. But he could make stuff. They dragged boards and other materials down from the scrap heap by Miss Bessie's pasture and built their castle stronghold in the place they had found in the woods. Leslie filled a 3-pound coffee can with crackers and dried fruit and a 1-pound can with strings and nails. They found 5 old Pepsi bottles, which they washed and filled with water, in case, as Leslie said, of siege. Like God in the Bible, they looked at what they had made and found it very good.
Your characters, including Terabithia, which really becomes a character in this book, are all real. I think you sense the emotional authenticity of them. Are they all you, or how do you know these different people?
Yeah, I guess basically they're all me if they have any feelings at all. Because the only feelings I know well are my own feelings. That doesn't mean that I'm proud of all of my feelings, but I have to be honest about them. In Jacob I love, I have to be honest about jealousy at a very deep level. In Bridge to Terabithia, I have to be honest about my own fears. So people who've read my books know me better than they have any right to know me, really. All the private parts of me.
Well, I'm always taken with the scene in Terabithia where Jesse and Leslie find out why the school bully is crying. Janice Avery is in the bathroom, and she's weeping. Could you share that scene with us and tell us what that says about you?
Oh, Lord, what was the matter with him? Janice Avery had given him nothing but trouble, and now he was feeling responsible for her, like one of the Burke's timber wolves or beached whales. She didn't even cry when the kids teased her about Willard after the note. Yeah, I know. He looked at her. Well, he said, what should we do? Do, she asked. What do you mean, what should we do? How could he explain it to her? Leslie, if she was an animal predator, we'd be obliged to try to help her. Leslie gave him a funny look. Well, you're the one who's always telling me I gotta care, he said. But Janice Avery? If she's crying, there's gotta be something really wrong. Well, what are you planning to do? He flushed. I can't go into no girl's room. Oh, I get it. You're going to send me into the shark's jaws. No, thank you, Mr. Aarons. Leslie, I swear, I'd go in there if I could. He really thought he would, too. You ain't scared of her, are you, Leslie? He didn't mean it in a daring way. He was just dumbfounded by the idea of Leslie being scared. She flashed her eyes at him and tossed her head back in that proud way she had. Okay, I'm going in. But I want you to know, Jess Aarons, I think it's the dumbest idea you ever had in your life.
Okay, this is, and they help this.
Oh dear, Janice Avery.
Yeah, they help this bully. Where is Katherine Paterson in that?
Well, it's back in the 4th grade at Calvin H. Wiley School when I was just off the boat.
Okay.
And everybody thought I was weird. I had no friends, but we had recess, the scariest hour of the day. And I went out on that huge playground and stood as close to the building as I could. And up from the bottom of the playground came Pansy and her 2 horrible friends. Pansy is such a wonderful name, but I couldn't name Janice Avery Pansy.
Nobody would have believed it.
I thought, Pansy, I am at last going to get my revenge. I am going to put you into my book. But the problem is, you see, I'll never know why Pansy was a bully. But I had to know why Janice Avery was a bully. So when I began to figure out why Janice Avery was a bully, I first began to feel a little bit sorry for her. And then I began to kind of like her. And it ruined this perfectly good revenge. But there you are.
Well, this is a tough book to read. I mean, even for somebody who's read it more than once, you don't shy away from tough topics. There's death, child abuse, poverty, and all of these kids experience these in a very emotionally true way. how is experiencing this through literature beneficial to young readers?
It gives us practice. I remember when we moved to Norfolk from Tacoma Park, and Mary was in the 6th grade, and she was so miserable. And she said, I've never had any practice moving. If I just had some practice moving, maybe I could do it. And I've always thought that books give you practice for real life. They not only help you understand yourself better and understand other people better, but you go through experiences in a book. You're enjoying reading about somebody else in a certain sense. You're enjoying. You're not enjoying it, but you're deeply engaged. The deepest kind of enjoyment in reading about someone else's trials, especially if they come through them. And I've had so many young adults and adults come to me and say, I read Bridge to Terabithia as a child. And then I remember vividly one young man, he was in college, and over the Christmas vacation, his best friend was killed in an automobile accident. And he was home when this happened, and he said, I went back and got my copy of Bridge to Terabithia that I'd read when I was 10 and reread it when my friend died, and I can't tell you what a comfort it was to me. And I thought, but if he hadn't had it when he was 10, he wouldn't have had it when he was 20. And so I think I want people to read Bridge to Terabithia before they have to experience the death of someone close to them, not as an antidote afterwards. You know, people say, well, this child I know, her sister died, so I gave her a copy of Bridge to Terabithia. And I think, too late. She should have had it long before.
Yeah.
And then she would realize being angry at her sister was a natural thing, that most people are angry after the death of someone close to them, or denying the fact that they're really dead. So I think it would be a great help growing up to know that these things are natural.
Interesting.
In fact, the mother, Lisa Hill's mother, said to me it wasn't until she read the book that she realized how angry she had been at Lisa for dying. And it was such a help to her to be able to acknowledge that.
Well, Terabithia has been adapted into a film that was produced by your son, David. Books and films tell stories very differently.
They have to.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a difference. But is the, I guess, what if any, is the difference in emotional impact of a film versus, or thematically, are they similar?
Yeah, well, the thing that David was determined was that it would be true to the feelings and the story. And so when he first began trying to get people to give him money, they said, well, the death of a child is such a downer. Couldn't we just hurt her a little bit? And when he said no, they said, what about a coma? Couldn't you just go into a coma? And he said no. And he kept, he refused to let anybody make it who was not going to let Leslie die, because that to him was the most important thing, to keep true to the story. And but the problem is, and that you have to see things in the film. In the book, you're making it in your own head, and your imagination does the work, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing, and which is why I write books and don't make movies. And so you're going to lose something. You're going to lose that intense investment that the reader makes in the book. But you'll gain something in seeing somebody else's vision of your story. And you hope the vision will pay a tribute to your story. But you know that it has to be visual. It has to be dramatic. It cannot all take place in a little boy's head, which a lot of the book takes place simply in Jess's head. And you're not going to have a running, what Jeff is thinking.
Sure.
And you're not going to have him give a monologue like Hamlet. You have to portray that so that it can be seen by the audience. So it's going to be a different media, but you hope people will say, well, it wasn't just like the book, but I liked it. I mean, that was what I hope people would say.
well, it struck me in seeing the film that it was emotionally true
Yes, I think it is.
to the book. And I wept.
I cried. I've seen the movie 5 times, and I've cried every time.
Yeah.
And one of the powerful scenes of the book is when Jess's father comes to the creek bed, and I was so afraid that would get messed up. And I thought, Robert Patrick. In fact, the first time I saw Robert Patrick, and this was at the premiere in Hollywood, I went up to him and kissed him, and I don't go around kissing strange men. And he looked at me like, who in the world are you? But I had to explain to him. I said, you don't know how important that scene is to me, and I was so terrified that it wouldn't be right, and you just did such a wonderful job with that.
What, if any, impact has the film had on the book?
Well, I was #1 on the bestseller list, which I never was when the book was first published. So I guess it had a very big impact. Yes, I made how many? I mean, the number of copies that were sold, even just before the movie came out, and then after the movie came out, and I got this wonderful letter from this young man who said, I am 18 years old and I ride motorcycles. I do not read books. I do not watch children's movies. But somehow I was just fiddling and I saw this Bridge to Terabithia movie. Don't ask me why I watched it. This is not the kind of movie I watch. But I watched it. And then I had to go buy the book. I do not buy books. I do not read books. But I had to write you and tell you how much I liked your book and your movie. It was just wonderful. So I'm getting readers that I never dreamed of having.
Interesting.
18-year-old motorcycle riders who never read books.
That's really cool.
Yeah, they're nice.
Well, Terabithia was given a very significant award, but so was Jacob Have I Loved.
Yes.
It too won the Newbery Award, but it's a very different book. It's narrated by Louise Bradshaw, the older by minutes twin, who constantly feels eclipsed by her more fragile and very talented sister, Caroline. It deals with jealousy, love, hate, politics, religion, and religion as a weapon, and a lot more. How did this book come about?
Well, I've said earlier that all of them were about me, but I didn't think this one was about me originally. I thought it was about other people, because I began suddenly aware that very intelligent friends of mine that I really liked and who seemed quite mature would say offhand things like, well, of course, my mother always loved him best. Or, when I was 7 years old, my older sister, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, there's some statute of limitations to what your sister did when you were 7 years old. I mean, come on. Do you want to live your entire life still jealous about what happened when you were a tiny kid? I just thought it was the weirdest thing. I thought, that would make a good idea for a book. I'm always desperately looking for ideas for books. And I thought, that is an age-old problem. In our Freudian age, we think it's the problem with parents and children. No. Problems between siblings are every bit as powerful as problems between parents and children. You go back to the Bible, the first murder, Cain kills his brother Abel. Rachel and Leah, the daughters of Jacob, there's another sibling. You just go through sibling rivalry after sibling rivalry. And I think, this is something that should be dealt with in a story. So I will write a book about jealousy between siblings. It wasn't about me at all until I started writing the book. I was so angry. Every time I went to the typewriter, I could hardly type. This is days when I was still doing this. And I thought, why am I so mad? I thought this was somebody else's story. What is being stirred up very deeply in me? Obviously, I was much more jealous than I had ever admitted to myself. So I hope the book cured me. I don't know, but it certainly turned out to be about me before it was all over.
Well, you establish the isolated island in the Chesapeake Bay in which the Bradshaws live in the first few pages of the book. And here again, we see setting as character.
Yes, of course, in this book, the setting is very, very important.
Yeah. Do you mind reading that?
No, I'd love to read that. The village in which we Bradshaws lived for more than 200 years covers barely a third of our island's length. The rest is saltwater marsh. As a child, I secretly welcomed the first warm day of spring by yanking off my shoes and standing waist deep in the cordgrass to feel the cool mud squish up between my toes. I chose the spot with care, for cordgrass alone is rough enough to rip the skin, and ours often concealed a bit of curling tin or shards of glass or crockery or jagged shells not yet worn smooth by the tides. In my nostrils, the faint hay smell of the grass mingled with that of the brackish water of the bay, while the spring wind chilled the tips of my ears and raised goosebumps along my arms. Then I would shade my eyes from the sun and search far across the water, hoping to see my father's boat coming home. I love Rass Island, although for much of my life I did not think I did. And it is a pure sorrow to me that, once my mother leaves, there will be no one left there with the name of Bradshaw. But there were only the two of us, my sister Caroline and me, and neither of us could stay.
Louise has dreams about her sister, even admitting the unthinkable about Caroline. Would you read the scene in which she reveals her nightmares?
This is not a pleasant scene. Hate. That was the forbidden word. I hated my sister. I, who belonged to a religion which taught that simply to be angry with another made one liable to the judgment of God, and that to hate was the equivalent of murder. I often dreamed that Caroline was dead. Sometimes I would get word of her death. The ferry had sunk with her and my mother aboard. Or more often, the taxi had crashed, and her lovely body had been consumed in the flames. Always there were two feelings in the dream: a wild exultation that now I was free of her, and terrible guilt. I once dreamed that I'd killed her with my own hands. I'd taken the heavy oak pole with which I guided my skiff. She had come to the shore begging for a ride. In reply, I had raised the pole and beat. In the dream, her mouth made the shape of screaming, but no sound came out. The only sound of the dream was my own laughter. I woke up laughing, a strange, shuddering kind of laugh that turned at once into sobs. "What's the matter, Wheeze?" I had awakened her. "I had a bad dream," I said. "I dreamed you were dead."
Oh, I get chills hearing that. This book is written in the first person by Louise as an adult looking back. What made you decide to use this voice? It's very different for you. And were you trying to distance the reader from those really powerful emotions?
Yeah.
Or bring them closer?
Oh, I started out, and it was written 40 years after the events. And Virginia said, my editor, who has been my editor since 1970, which is something of a record, so she always tells the truth. She said, that's far too removed from the story itself. You're going to have to, if you want to have that opening, you need to come closer to the time of the story. So I squeezed it and made her a young adult in the beginning. I wrote the story originally. I was going to write it in third person because I'd never written a book in first person, and I don't like first person. It just is so self-absorbed, and you can't see as much as if you write it in third person. And it kept being written in first person, and I thought, oh well, this is just the first draft, and the first draft is garbage. I'll fix it when I revise. So I started revising, and it kept going back to first person. And I thought, well, this is just the second draft. I'll fix it when I revise. And then I realized I was writing the story of jealousy, and jealousy can only see one point of view. Total blinders. She can't see how much her parents love her. She can't even see that Caroline loves her. She can only see everything from her own extremely narrow, jealous point of view. So there was no way to write the book in any other voice except Louise's voice. And some, critics have said, but you trust your readers too much to see. And of course I trust my readers. I've got the best readers in the world. Why shouldn't I trust them? And they do see.
There's also a sly humor in Jacob, some of it having to do with religion on the island. I particularly like Louise's take on her spiritual health.
Oh yes, her spiritual health, about which she says, my spiritual health was about on a par with a person who's been dead 3 days. But I wasn't about to admit it and get prayed for out loud on Wednesday night by that bunch of old souks. Souks are crabs, in case anybody doesn't know.
Well, you create memorable characters. Louise is certainly a memorable character. So is Caroline, and all of the other secondary characters in that novel. Not that anybody's secondary. But one of the most memorable characters that you've ever created is Gilly. The great Gilly Hopkins was awarded a Newbery Honor and given a National Book Award. Tell us about Gilly and how her story came about.
Well, this can be another very long story, but I will try to keep it succinct. We have 4 children. We have 2 daughters who are both adopted and 2 homemade boys. And I had to do that because people said, now explain to me about your family, who the real children are and they were all very real. I mean, who are the natural children? And no, there are no unnatural children. So I thought I've got to figure out a way to talk about my family so I'm not embarrassing people and I'm not being rude. So I thought if I say homemade, even a 6-year-old was going to understand that, right? And I did say that in public, and my daughter Mary, who's more polite than I am, took me aside afterwards and said, Mom, when you say that, you make John and David sound like Pillsbury Doughboys. But anyhow, because we had adopted the girls, when Cambodia fell and Vietnam fell, this whole bunch of kids landed at Dulles Airport with no identification, no papers. And they couldn't just stay at the airport. Nobody knew. They figured out finally they were not Vietnamese. They were Cambodian because they didn't speak Vietnamese, and they spoke Khmer, and they finally found a Khmer translator who could say, no, these children are from Cambodia. They put them in the Presbyterian church in Leesburg because they couldn't leave them in the airport, and then they began calling the social agencies around the D.C. area, trying to find people who would take them in until they could figure out what to do with them. And because Mary had been adopted through Lutheran Social Service, they called us and said, would you be willing to take 2 brothers until we can arrange for them to be more permanently settled? And I said, 4 kids, 6 kids, what's the difference? Well, it was a huge difference. And of course, the boys were troubled. I mean, they wouldn't be with us if they had no troubles. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was I began to realize there was something wrong with my attitude. And I began to listen to what I was saying inside my head, and I was saying things like, well, I can't really settle that problem. They're only going to be here for a few weeks. Or thank goodness they're only going to be here for a few weeks. And when I could hear what I was saying internally, I was horrified. I was treating 2 human beings as though they were Kleenex. And human beings are not disposable. But I was thinking, here I thought I was this lovely woman, and I was not a lovely woman. I was thinking of 2 human beings as though I could get rid of them any time. And so therefore I didn't have to take them really seriously. So I began to think, well, how would I feel if I thought people regarded me as disposable? And I thought, I would be furious. And I would try to get them before they got me, which is, of course, Gilly Hopkins. But after the book was published, and this is how funny it is for writers, because you write things that you don't know what you're doing. After the book was published, I realized I'd put a second foster child in the book. And I might very well have been William Ernest, who, if treated as disposable, would dispose of himself. And so that was the beginning of how I wrote the story. And I had wanted to write a funny book because Bridge to Terabithia, although there are funny things in Bridge to Terabithia, I keep trying to tell people they're funny things. It's not regarded as a particularly funny book. And in all of my Japanese books, I would either kill people or maim people or do something horrible. So I thought, I'm going to write a funny book. I'm not going to kill anybody off. I'm just going to have fun with this book. And I really had a lot of fun writing this book. And there's a scene in there. Maybe you'll let me read it, maybe. Are you going to let me read that scene at Thanksgiving Day? Scene? Is that...
If you can find it, go ahead.
It is not marked. But I wrote that Thanksgiving scene, and I was laughing so hard I could hardly write. And I thought, no, I'll calm down, reread it. And I thought, this is not the funniest scene I've ever written. This is the funniest scene anyone has ever written. Well, fortunately, my love was blind and my sight returned. And I realized it's not the funniest scene anybody's ever written, but it really is a funny scene. And then I read it out loud to my family on vacation because my husband had read it to himself. And he said, "You're gonna have to do something about that book. It's too intense." And I thought, this is my funny book. So I thought I better read it out loud to the kids and see if they react the same way my husband did. So I'm reading it out loud, and my kids are falling off the chair laughing to my great satisfaction. My husband's sitting in the corner weeping. So it's some argument as to whether it's funny or not, all right? But, okay. Do you mind if I read this?
No, I think it's wonderful.
Okay?
Go ahead.
Well, what's happened is everybody in the household is sick, including Mr. Randolph, that they've moved over from next door. Okay. The doorbell rang. She jumped at the sound. Her first fear was that the lawyer's son had not believed Mr. Randolph's excuses for not coming to Virginia for Thanksgiving and had come to get him. Then, with annoyance, she realized that it was probably Agnes Stokes sneaking around to find out why Gilly had skipped school for a few days. But when she opened the door, it was to a small, plump woman whose gray hair peeked out from under a close-fitting black felt hat. She wore black gloves and a black and tweed overcoat, which was a little too long to be fashionable, and carried a slightly worn black alligator bag over one arm. The woman, who was an inch or so shorter than she was, looked up into Gilly's face with a sort of peculiar expression. Whether frightened or hungry, Gilly couldn't have said. At any rate, it made her shift uncomfortably and push at her bangs until she remembered two of Trotter's trusty sentences for emergency use and offered both of them. "Well, we're not buying anything today, thank you, and we're faithful members of the Baptist Church." She hurried to close the door. "No, wait, please," the lady said. "Galadriel Hopkins?" Gilly yanked the door open. "Who are you?" she blurted out, as awkwardly as William Ernest might have. It was the woman's turn to look uncomfortable. I suppose I'm your grandmother." Somehow Gilly would have been less surprised if the woman had said fairy godmother. "May I come in?" Dumbly, Gilly stepped back and let her in. The sound of snoring poured forth from the dining room. Gilly willed the woman not to look, not to stare at the funny little brown face poked up above the faded quilt, the mouth gaped open and trembling with each noisy breath. But of course the woman looked, jerked her head slightly at the sight, and then turned quickly back to Gilly. "Gilly, honey, who is it?" Damn, Trotter must have heard the bell. "Okay, Trotter, I got it." Gilly yelled as she tugged at her shrunken T-shirt, the last half-clean one, and tried to make it cover her navel. "Want to sit down?" she asked the visitor. "Yes, please." Gilly led the way into the living room and backed up to the couch, sticking a hand out toward the brown chair. Plunk! They both sat down in unison like string puppets, the lady right on the edge of the chair so that her short feet could touch the floor. So, the woman was bobbing her little black hat. Didn't anyone in the world wear hats these days? So, Gilly tried to take it in, and at this point, the woman tells her that she's her grandmother. I didn't know she'd had a baby. Wouldn't you think she'd want her own mother to know she'd had a baby? This was obviously the point where she, Gilly, was supposed to come into the story, but it still seemed far too remote, like something that had happened once to a friend of a friend. She tried to nod in a sympathetic manner. Gilly, I called you and called you. William Ernest stood clutching the doorway for support, his face still flushed with fever. He was dressed in his long grayish-white underwear. At the sight of a stranger, he stopped dead. The woman looked at him once hard, then as she had done with Mr. Randolph, she looked quickly away. I'm sorry, W.E., Gilly said. I didn't hear you call me. What's the matter? As soon as she asked, she knew his long johns were wet all down the front. Gilly jumped up. Excuse me, I'll be right back. She hustled the boy back to his room as fast as you could hustle a boy who was still weak from fever and lack of food. It was hard to be patient with him on the stairs. You shouldn't have come downstairs, William Ernest. You're sick. I wet, he said sadly. I couldn't help it. She said, I know. When you're sick, you just can't help it. She got him the last clean underwear, which was short and wouldn't be as warm, and changed his sheets. She took a dry blanket off her own bed. He climbed in and turned his back to her at once, his strength exhausted. Gilly, honey? Trotter called drowsily as Gilly passed her door. You got company down there? Just playing the TV. Gilly smoothed her hair and tugged again at her shirt as she went down the stairs. She knew she looked a wreck. She must have shocked the poor old lady right out of her socks. The woman gave a weak smile and nodded when Gilly came in. You poor little thing, she said. Gilly looked behind to see if W. had followed her down. Bless your heart. There was no one else around. Me? Courtney didn't exaggerate. I'm just so glad you're here. You wrote her, my dear. How could they have put you in such a place? There was a thump, thump, thumping on the stairs. Both of them sat stark still and listened as it drew inexorably nearer. Ooh, the little lady gasped. Swaying in the doorway was a huge barefoot apparition in striped men's pajamas, gray hair cascading over its shoulders, a wild look in its eyes. I forgot, it was moaning as it swayed. I forgot. It grabbed frantically at the woodwork. I forgot. Gilly sprang to her feet. What did you forget, damn it? The turkey. Trotter was almost sobbing now. $15.38, and I let it go to rot. She gave no sign that she had noticed the visitor. Nothing's gone to rot. I would have smelled it, wouldn't I? Gilly couldn't help sneaking a sideways glance at the little woman who looked almost as frightened as W.E. did when he spied a new word in his reading book. Go back to bed, Trotter. I'll put it right in the oven. The huge woman made an effort to obey, but nearly fell down just trying to turn around. I better sit a minute, she said. My head's light. Gilly grabbed the back of the striped pajamas with both hands and half dragged, half supported the faltering frame toward the couch. But she knew, just as one knows when filing on the final block, that the tower will fall. She knew they couldn't make it. Oh, mercy. Trotter gave a little cry. She came crashing down, pinning Gilly to the rug beneath her. The woman lay there, flapping on her back like a giant overturned tortoise. Well, I done it. She gave a short, hysterical giggle. Squish jujitsu. What? What? What is it? The third night-clothed actor had made his appearance. You all right, ain't you, Gilly, honey? Asked Trotter, and without waiting for an answer. Sorry, Mr. Randolph. But someone fell. I heard someone fall. Yeah, I fell all right. Trotter was rocking her huge trunk in a vain effort to get to her feet. But it's okay, ain't it, Gilly, honey? Just roll, Trotter, she said in a muffled voice. Roll over and you'll be off me. What's that? What's that? Mr. Randolph squeaked. It's poor little Gilly. Trotter grunted and with a supreme rolled off onto the floor. Miss Gilly? He was asking anxiously. I'm okay, Mr. Randolph. Gilly got up, dusted herself off, then took him by the hand. Let's get you back to bed. By the time she returned from the dining room, Trotter had somehow hoisted herself into a sitting position on the couch and dizzily clutching the cushions with both hands, had found herself face to face with a white-faced stranger. You said there wasn't no one here, she accused Gilly. Well,
I think it's
Far
darn
too much
funny.
reading.
But no, I think it's interesting because it introduces Gilly in a different way. I mean, you know, there's lots to offend people in this book.
Yeah, you may have to beep a few of the lines.
Well, Gilly uses
Yeah,
profanity.
but you know, her mouth has to match
Who
her
she
anger.
is, yeah.
I'm sorry, you know, it's very mild
It is.
profanity as profanity goes these days. But if she said fiddlesticks when she was frustrated, you wouldn't believe her, would you?
No, and Trotter is just a lovely character. She's big in stature, literally and figuratively, and she's got a heart as big as her body. Well, Gilly is an amazing character, and she continues in that vein, and then she winds up in a very different circumstance.
Getting what she wanted,
Yeah.
which is not what she wanted when she gets it.
But she manages to stay in touch with who she loves, and her world is bigger as a result. The one disappointment is her mother. As I said, you don't give your characters a break,
Oh, well,
do you?
you know, it's interesting because kids who've lived this life, they know it's the right ending. Kids who haven't are very angry with me.
Well, I think it's very satisfying. I also think it's very hopeful. Is that what differentiates books for young readers as opposed to adults?
Well, it's, you know, I think you write who you are. And if you're not a hopeful person, your hope at the end of the book is going to be fake because you don't really hope.
Oh, interesting.
But I'm a very hopeful person, and I'm also an extremely realistic person. So my books are tough, but they're, I hope, full of grace and hope.
Interesting. In your role as national ambassador for young people's literature, that's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful. I have to practice myself.
You suggest that to read for life is a crucial skill. How does that mesh with your philosophy of hope versus realism? I mean, it seems to me that hope and realism are in conflict frequently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I think reading does let us know what the world is like. Unless we're reading nothing but fluffy fantasies, even a really well-written fantasy helps us to know what the world is like, even if it's talking about a very different world. But I think because reading is so engaging and demands so much, it does things for us that electronic media is not going to do. I don't know how to Twitter or anything, but there's a site that people can tweet to, and they will send the message to me. And at first, I didn't understand about Twitter, and there was all these misspelled words, and I had to to find out what it was all about. And then I realized that this is a special language on it. It's not a language that enlarges the spirit. It's not a language that people don't read the newspaper. So how are you going to have thoughtful discussions about what's going on in the world if you don't read a newspaper, or if you don't read serious magazines, or if you don't read books? How are we preparing people to be citizens, intelligent, voting citizens, if they're not opening themselves up to the sources of information that only reading can give you? So I really think we have to read not only for our personal lives, to enlarge us personally, but for the sake of our country, for the sake of the world.
I was at the ceremony in which you were appointed and took the mantle of National Ambassador, and you said, read for your life.
Yeah.
And So did you want to elaborate on that anymore?
Just very briefly, I think you read for your own life, for your own sake, to understand yourself better, to understand other people better, to understand your world better, but also so that you can be a more responsible person in your community and in your family and in your school and in the world.
Yeah. Well, we've run out of time, Katherine Paterson. Many thanks for being with us today. I'd also like to thank the students in the studio from Prince William County. Thanks, too, to the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program. Goodbye.